for us. So just a wee bit of housekeeping first of all. We don't have a fire alarm planned, so if it does go off, we will be running out the door at the front as you came in, or at the fire exit at the back. Just follow one of the staff members with a red badge on. And the toilets are just at the counter as well if you do need to go to the toilet. Hopefully this library won't blow up like Marnie does in one of her books at the start of it. And we'll hopefully get away in one piece. I'd like to wish a thanks to Creative Scotland who supply the funding for Encounters Festival and help us put this festival on throughout the month of October. This is a first for Encounters in two reasons. It's the first ebook author that we've had along to the festival, and it's also the first time we have broadcasted live on the internet as well. So it's a wee bit of a special event for us, and we're really looking forward to it. Now, the star of tonight is Marnie Riches. She grew up in a rough estate in Manchester, studied in Cambridge, and she has tried her hand at being a punk, a trainee rock star, a pretend artist, and she is now a successful author. She has authored 6 children's books and the Time Hunters series, but she has now started writing crime thrillers starring George McKenzie, and those are The Girl Who Wouldn't Die, The Girl Who Broke the Rules, and The Girl Who Walked in the Shadows, and they are all available on her Borrow Box service, as we discussed earlier. And she has got a new one coming out in November, is that right?
Yeah.
Yep, November, which is called The Girl Who Had No Fear. And I'll pass it on now to Marnie to tell us a wee bit more about herself and her books. All right?
Thank you very much. Well, thanks all for coming, and thanks to Encounters Festival for having me. Yeah, my name's Marnie Riches, and I author the George McKenzie series, as you've seen here. And well, I guess you might be interested to hear how I got into writing. As Chris has pointed out, I did start out over 10 years ago now as an aspiring children's author. What happened was I always wrote quite enthusiastically when I was a kid. And in fact, when I was a student, I did a degree at Cambridge University in German and Dutch. And my first attempt at a novel was a novelisation of an epic 12th century Dutch poem about Charlemagne the Great, which you could say is niche interest, to say the least. So I novelised that, and it was absolutely terrible. It was just trash. And it went into a wardrobe for 17 years. And I did some living in between, and I had a couple of kids and got married. Well, the other way around. And but always had this creative hankering. And that manifested itself in some property development that I did when my kids were really small. I used to buy crappy old houses and do them up. And you know, that satisfied my creative urges. But then in 2000 it must have been around 2008, or something like that, the credit crunch happened. I'd started to try and write picture books, but the credit crunch put an abrupt halt to my property developing aspirations, and I was desperately unhappy in a kind of part-time fundraising job, because I used to be a professional fundraiser. And I thought, right, I'm really going to gun for this writing malarkey. My kids were very small at the time. And so I got out this terrible novel about Charlemagne the Great. I found it, it was covered in dust. Reread it, it made me blush, it was that bad. But I thought, I'm going to rewrite this. There's definitely something here. People want to hear about Charlemagne the Great. And I rewrote it, and I rewrote it, and no one did want to hear about Charlemagne the Great. And like an author before me, I sent it out to agents, it got rejected. I did a picture book, because I also paint, that got rejected. But I did get an agent and started to write for 9+-year-olds, and thought, yeah, if J.K. Rowling can do it, I'm going to have a go at that. But then I realised that A, I loved crime fiction, and B, I'm quite filthy, really, and swear, and you know, quite like violence and crime, and I'd grown up around crime and on a gritty estate, which I'll tell you more about in a sec. So I decided that I was going to try my hand at something a little more challenging. I was going to write a great crime novel. And my golden standard for that was The Silence of the Lambs, which I'd read when I was a student, and it had been on the cinema as well. It was a huge film then. And I remember being blown away by it and thinking, cool, that's cracking. I love this idea of Hannibal the Cannibal, and that Clarice Starling's pretty cool as well, and Jamie Gummy wears his victims. It was so macabre, and I loved it so much on many different levels. And I liked the fact that it was much more complex than a lot of children's novels, which are often planned in a very simple way. They've got simple linear plots, although they're funny, and that's what I loved about children's fiction. So anyway, so I read the Stieg Larsson books. So The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, met Elizabeth Salander on the page for the first time and realised, and I was introduced to Larsson by my ex-mother-in-law, who is Swedish. So the idea of Scandinoir resonated with me naturally. And when I read the Larsson's books, I thought, well, you know, they're a bit unwieldy and slightly clunky, but the stories are fantastic, and I love Elizabeth Salander. I think she's a really kick-ass character. And he's dead now, so like no one's writing his books anymore. I'll have a go at this. So I started to write this book about a girl who was an aspiring criminologist, and I decided to set the books mainly in Amsterdam because I'd lived in Utrecht. When I was doing my German and Dutch degree, I spent a year just south of Amsterdam in Utrecht. I thought, yeah, that's kind of like Stockholm, but more interesting actually, you know, something I know about, and you know, you've got that kind of Nordic feel, and everyone drinks a lot of coffee and is stoic, and it rains a lot and it's quite cloudy and it's cold and miserable, so I can do all of that, tick, and I'll make her kick-ass in my own little way. And I started to write, it was called Blown Away at the time, and if you've read The Girl Who Wouldn't Die, you'll know that there's a leitmotif runs through it. This notion of being blown away, so there's the element of explosions, because in the book there's ostensibly a jihadist, although it turns out it's not, but I don't want to give away the plot too much. So there's the notion of being blown away also by this young girl's experiences. It's almost like a rite of passage story. She's doing her third year at university, and then there's this recurring image of this cherry blossom tree in her back garden when she's a kid, and the blossom being blown away on the breeze. So that was my clever leitmotif running through the book, and that's why I wanted to call it Blown Away. But of course my publisher, when they got hold of it, thought that was a crap idea, and they were like, no, we're going to call it The Girl Who Wouldn't Die, because the girl sounds a bit like, you know, the girl with the dragon tattoo, otherwise it's going to get lost in the eBook world. So, you know, there were sound commercial reasons for naming the series The Girl Who, blah, blah, blah. That's how the name came about. And the reason that I wanted to write about George McKenzie was when I was a children's writer, I was also working at an organisation called Common Word in Manchester, which is a grassroots literary development agency. So they help aspiring writers to write, and it's often people from marginal groups that go to the workshops there. So they're like unemployed people, disabled folk, there's a women's writing group, there's a lesbian, gay, bi and transgender group, and mainly what the groups they run are also for black writers, black, Asian and minority ethnic writers. And I was the fundraiser there, because I've done professional fundraising as a career for years. And I felt very strongly about diversity in fiction, and that there weren't enough, you know, that fiction was too white, basically. And I wanted to do something about this. Because I'm from I'm white, but I'm from a minority ethnic background. And I think a lot of people in Britain are, you know, second or third generation immigrants coming from all over the show. So So I have family that came from Eastern Europe. And I'd come from a really rough council estate, so a lot of the kind of white middle class protagonists that you get in a lot of commercial fiction didn't really say anything to me. So I thought, well, I'm going to make my criminologist a black girl from a really crappy part of London, and she'll come from really very humble beginnings, similar to mine. I was from a one-parent family, and my mother, she kicked my dad out when I was very small and struggled to bring me up on her own and did menial jobs and was often unemployed. It was a difficult time in the 70s when unemployment was very high. But I used education to get out the ghetto, and similarly I wanted my heroine to do that and to be very bright and succeed despite her humble beginnings. So that's why George McKenzie became the woman that she is in the books. She's a girl who is from the wrong side of the tracks and is very outspoken and has a tremendous chip on her shoulder, but is also very successful, very good at what she does, and understands the criminal mind. So I'm going to read you a little extract from The Girl Who Wouldn't Die, and I'm going to tell you. This basically tells you how the book started life. I'll tell you the little story behind this extract. So do bear with me. Right, okay. So this is taken from early on in the book, and it's about a character called Ella Williams May, who lives in southeast London. So, Ella Williams May stared intently at the flickering old TV set, willing the night to pass without incident. A dark-haired actress was bouncing up and down on naked actor Richard Gere's lap, officer and a gentleman. The movie was so old that the quality of the picture would have been fuzzy even on a top-of-the-range HD TV. But her mother liked Richard Gere, and late-night pre-Christmas television was all about the repeats. "Turn it up," her mother said. "I can't hear it." Ella tutted and turned up the volume a fraction. "More," her mother said. "But we won't be able to hear if they come," she said. "Like I'm bothered tonight," her mother said. "I should be out partying, not babysitting you. It's nearly Christmas anyway. Can't see anything happening tonight." Her mother dragged hard on her cigarette and exhaled through her nostrils. Ella thought she looked like a dragon when she did that. Letitia the dragon, with her shining long claws painted in rainbow colours, studded with diamante, always fake. Letitia the dragon took a swig from her glass of vodka and orange, rose from her sagging armchair, and snatched the remote control from Ella. "Louder," I said. "Who's the bloody parent in this house?" Ella said nothing. Ella knew they should keep it low. Ella knew there could still be trouble. Richard Gere's friend had just hanged himself when the trouble started. Low voices out back, dark shapes moving beyond the fence, then a broken bottle on the back path. Smash. Footsteps running away quickly. Whistles. Ella grabbed her hockey stick. "Kill the lights," Letitia shouted, her cigarette twitching between her shaky fingers. Loud knocking at the front door then. "Don't go," Ella said. "It'll be..." Letitia slid silently into the kitchen at the front. Ella followed, keeping low, creeping stealthily. She raised her head above the windowsill, but Letitia was already standing tall, flailing her arms around, shouting, "Those bastards set fire to my house!" Ella rushed to the front door ahead of Letitia. The door was open now, flames bubbling up the council's standard issue red paint, quickly extinguished with a pot full of liquid flung by Letitia. Letitia always had something fun in the pot standing by the door, ready to throw when occasion demanded. Now the door reeked of petrol and piss. Glass on the floor out front, and by the gate, an intact Coke bottle with a singed rag stuffed in the neck that had failed to ignite properly. "Petrol bomb? They petrol bombed us," Ella said, transfixed by the tableau before her. She ran inside, heart thudding, picked up the phone. Don't call the police, Letitia shouted. Are you mad? Think I want to be labelled as a grass? Ella ignored her and dialed 999. She held the receiver to her ear and squatted in the lounge, where the flickering screen of the TV was the only source of light. Richard Gere was smiling now, talking without sound, lips moving, carefree, smart in his uniform. In the second she waited to be connected, she heard their voices again at the back. She could see them through the net curtains, moving below the street light. Which service do you require, please? The woman at the other end asked. Police, quick, they're here, Ella said. The gate clicked as they crept into the garden. Right up the back path, brazen now. Ella could see their hooded silhouettes as they skulked by the door. She fired the details of her name and address at the woman on the phone. Come quickly, she shouted. Too late. Ella screamed. It takes more than one go to smash an entire window in with a crowbar. The crowbar doesn't do a clean job, and glass is much harder to break than people think. Danny and his boys smacked the window hard, twice, and left only small shards stuck to the white UPVC frames. They'd had a lot of practice lately. Oh Danny boy, the sirens are calling, Ella thought. So that's my first little extract that I wanted to read you from the first book. And this was how this novel came into being, was that petrol bombing scene actually happened to me and my mother when I was a kid. So we were living on a really terrible estate in North Manchester, and the kids on there were feral. And my mother was a single parent, and I was, how old was I? About 15? Yeah, about 15. And I went to a posh girls' school. I'd got a free place, and I was the kid in the posh uniform. And my mum was known for being a grass, so when the kids threw stones out the window, she used to call the police. And it got her into a whole heap of trouble. And it didn't help also that, you know, we had this minority ethnic roots, and there was terrible. The National Front had a real grip on council estates back in the 70s and early 80s. So it was tough times, and they used to pick on us because we were easy targets. And that happened exactly as I'd written it there. And I did write that as a kind of short story, because for years I had this recurring nightmare of that night when these kids had shown up at the back of the house and had thrown bottles down the back path. And then they came round, as it happens in the book, and then we hear something flung against the front door, and it was a petrol bomb. And then, to add insult to injury, they came back and put the window in, and it was a very hard and traumatic way of being for a teenage girl, and it's stuck with me into adulthood, as I'm sure you can imagine. And in my dreams I would just replay that horrible scenario over and over. And it did end up that the whole of the back of the house was boarded up and the windows were nailed down and stuff until we moved out. And the minute we moved out, they set fire to the place. So, and I think there are lots of council estates in urban areas that are no different. I'm sure you've got them in Glasgow. Certainly southeast London, where I did used to live, excuse the dodgy accent. There's some really terrible places. So I wrote this short story not really knowing what to do with it. And I called it Glass, after the broken glass. And I was wondering whether I should do it as some kind of gritty young adult story. And it didn't work. And then I gave it a supernatural twist, and that didn't work. And then when I decided to write the crime novel, all of a sudden it worked, and it fitted straight in. And there is a twist in this book where this character Ella Williams-May, you realise how she slots into the story, how she fits in with George McKenzie, the main girl. So basically, I started to write crime that was inspired by my own experiences as a kid. And Letitia, the mother in that passage, she's a tough nut, and she does a bit of she's a bit light-fingered at work, and she has a fiddle going, and she's like lots of women that you meet on estates that are just scratching by, trying to keep the kids fed. So my inspiration largely came from life. And my other main character in the series is a chief inspector in the Dutch police called Paul van den Bergen. And he's not like George at all. He's about 20 years older, although I don't think it's a spoiler to say that they kind of meet and fall in love over the course of the series. They're an unlikely pair, but they do get together anyway. And I wanted him, I'd read a few crime novels and thought, you know, there's this kind of hackneyed stereotype of detective as a hardened drinker and a terrible husband, you know, kind of grizzled misanthrope. And I like the grizzled misanthrope, and I kept a bit of that for Van den Bergen. But I wanted him to be a hypochondriac. I thought that if you're in a job like that, you're going to be terribly anxious. So whereas George, my main character, she's got a touch of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Van den Bergen, the main detective in it, he's got terrible health anxiety. So that's where he came from, and there's a lot of me in it because I also I suffer from a bit of OCD and health anxiety. I don't mind admitting. So you get these very gritty characters, and then you get the respectable Dutch characters come in. I'm going to talk to you a bit about character in a second. And also George's family. Actually, I've not talked about George, have I? Right, George, so she's my main character. I've just talked to you about why I started writing the series. Well, she does all the things I'd like to have done, really. She's mouthy, and she's young, and she's not encumbered by children and responsibilities. And, you know, she's 20 in the first novel, and she's doing her Erasmus year in Holland, so that's how it comes about that she works with the Dutch police. I'm going to read you an extract. You tell me if I get boring reading out, because I know when I go to talks and people read long extracts, I just want to stick pins in mine a little bit after a while. But I'm going to keep these nice and short. So. George is terribly saucy and she swears a lot, so forgive me if you don't like swearing. Right, so this is from The Girl Who Wouldn't Die. She wrote 6 sentences, arranged her pens and pencils into parallel lines, stood up, rubbed her numb bottom and strode over to the window. Peered into the rooms that were also on the top floor in the houses on the opposite side of the canal. It had been a while since she'd done that. Normally, she preferred to admire the tiled rooftops. When she'd moved into Jan's attic, she'd been careful to analyse what she could about her neighbours opposite by looking in through the windows. The narrow canal which divided the street below meant that the windows were a good distance away, so she used the zoom on her camera. It wasn't perfect, but it sufficed. From this, she extrapolated that those rooms that technically faced onto her own contained cardboard boxes stacked about 10 high and a bare hall, what looked to be some kind of artist's atelier, and finally what George reasoned had to be a prostitute's room, since the brown and orange 1970s curtains were almost always shut. Feeling her curiosity suddenly piqued, George dug out her camera and used the zoom to look once again into the neighbours' windows. The atelier still looked like an atelier, full of large, half-done canvases. Today, a man in a boiler suit with what seemed to be a very large 1970s Burt Reynolds moustache was painting something rubbish with vigour. The prostitute's room still had the curtains closed. The box room was still full of boxes, but George noticed that there was something reflecting the light in the window itself. "Now what's going on here?" she said. She tried to zoom in further, but the camera was already doing its best. Was it dream capture? Was it an optical illusion? Just somebody's light reflecting from a window on her side of the canal? No, too far away. Then frowning, she realised what it was. "I'll swear blind that's a camera's lens," she said, "or maybe a telescope. Shit. Was it angled towards her room? It certainly looked that way." She felt fluttering in her chest, dizzy, shaking her head in disbelief. How long has that been there? She looked back and forth from the lens to her window, narrowing her eyes and cursing. The angle was right, she was certain of it, and the gabled windows to her right and left, the attic rooms of the adjacent houses, were too far away to be the subject of interest for the unidentified peeping Tom. Somebody's been spying on me. Feeling a mixture of indignant outrage, panic and curiosity, she threw on a baggy purple mohair cardigan and marched down to the small bridge that led to the opposite side of the street. She was still wearing her slippers, but here in the red light district where sex shops competed with audience participation sex theatres, the curb crawlers and Monday morning passers-by paid her no heed. I'm going to fucking nail this bastard right now, she promised herself. As she pushed open the glazed door to the building that provided such excellent vantage point for her dedicated stalker, opened the cardboard box containing his new CCTV equipment, ran a finger over the small but perfectly formed high-res unit, and started to dismantle the old camera tripod that sat in the window. He knew she was only downstairs now. His gaze landed on the lump hammer that sat on the only chair in the room, along with his phone and keys. He crept down the stairs and watched the conversation unfold through the glass door which stood ajar. Who rents the room upstairs? She demanded of the behemoth of a shop assistant who stood in the sex shop, stacking the shelves with red rubber cocks. These were sandwiched between rubber fists and Jackrabbit brand vibrators in gaudy pinks and purples. The assistant was easily 7 foot tall and around the 20 stone mark. Looking her up and down, the assistant shrugged. You police? You don't look like police. Do police wear slippers? The assistant nodded and pointed at her with a rubber cock. What do you want to know? I live opposite at the Crack Pot, she said. I just need to find out who's renting your storeroom. They overlook me. The assistant scratched his giant head with the cock. I don't know about the upstairs tenants. I'm just a dildo peddling sales monkey. The boss isn't in. Come back later this evening about 7. She gave him a quick smile. Nice cock. Should he walk in now and lure her upstairs? His breathing quickened at the thought. A chance meeting on the stairs. Oh, how nice, fancy that. What a strange coincidence. Yes, come upstairs and inspect the room by all means. The lump hammer sat heavy in his trouser pocket, the handle protruding to allow for snap decisions. She turned in his direction. So that's George, the main character. And as you can see, she doesn't pull any punches, and as you can see, a lot of the books are set in the red light district. And that was something that fascinated me about Amsterdam, was the fact that you could have all this historical splendour and cultural magnificence, which the Dutch are famed for, and yet such a lot of sleaze. And I love Amsterdam's red light district because, you know, it is two extremes under one roof kind of thing. And I think that had I been a student there instead of Utrecht, which was terribly respectable, I would have loved to have lived in the red light district and just watched the comings and goings of people. And you get all walks of life there. Tourists who are just rubbernecking, and you get stag parties that go and partake of the, cornucopia of things that are on offer there, and lots of students, of course. It's a fascinating place, and it just struck me as a fantastic place to set a crime thriller. You can imagine, you know, you see these red lights and you see the women working in the booths, and you think, well, what's your story? How have you ended up in Amsterdam working in the sex industry? And one of the recurring themes in this series is trafficking, and of course people trafficking is a really big problem. And although prostitution in Amsterdam is quite sanitised and above board and legal, you still get an awful lot of stuff going on. It's not quite okay, you know, that's not quite sanctioned by the law. So it's the epicentre for ecstasy production. So there's a lot of drugs go on, Class A drugs, apart from marijuana, which is legalised over there and available in coffee shops. but you also, in amongst the legitimate prostitutes that are working, council sanctioned and have their own legitimate businesses running, you get people moving through via Germany a lot of the time that have been trafficked. So for me it was an endless source of inspiration, just to wonder how people had fallen into that kind of lifestyle and what it must be like to run a coffee shop where you sell marijuana for a living. So for example, in the first book, George lives above the coffee shop and her landlord runs the coffee shop downstairs and is an old hippie, and her neighbours are prostitutes. And one is a Dutch woman who's got kids to feed, and the other one's an Eastern European who's come in search of a better life. And I thought, in writing these books, it was very important not to judge people who end up on the fringes of criminal activity, but aren't necessarily bad people. So I think it's fair to judge traffickers and drug dealers quite harshly. You know, the big guys who are sanctioning violence and are behind these enormous transnational rings that make a lot of money and there's a lot of violence behind it. I have absolutely no compunction in painting them to be psychopaths, bad guys. But then everyone's got a story, haven't they? So in the most recent George book, The Girl Who Had No Fear, half of that takes place in Central America. And I've been over to Mexico a couple of times and was fascinated by the place. And the problem there is that the state has by and large failed its people. There's an awful lot of corruption, there's an awful lot of poverty. And what the gangs offer is a career path almost, and an income, and a means of feeding your family if you can get involved in their criminal structures. So it was very important for me when I was painting a picture of Salvadoran maras, the street gangs that are all covered in tattoos, that I made it very clear that a lot of them are doing it because there's no other viable alternative. You know, they either get trafficked north through Mexico, hopefully to cross the border into America, or they work in the fields for a pittance and starve, or they get involved with gangs, and at least then they can feed their families. So there's all sorts of reasons why people get involved in crime, and in fact George McKenzie has got this shady past, and it stems from poverty. Sometimes there's just no other way of doing things because your opportunities are so limited. So I was quite keen to explore why criminals do what they do and why people who end up as victims end up as victims. So in the second book, The Girl Who Broke the Rules, that's basically about organ trafficking, and there's a prostitute right at the beginning that I don't mind telling you, she gets eviscerated, and they're trying to work out why. And she's ended up working in the red light district of Amsterdam because she was trafficked there by Italian people traffickers from Somalia. So this is all about this series is about vulnerable people and how they end up doing things that they never envisaged doing. Through no fault of their own, just trying to find a better life or being double-crossed by family. And in fact, in The Girl Who Walked in the Shadows, there's quite a lot in there about the Roma. So, the Roma live in pockets all over Europe and have left their native countries of southeastern Europe, Romania and Bulgaria, trying to find a better life. And everywhere they go, they're kind of on the fringes and they're not welcome because they turn up in caravans and they set up kind of temporary sites and there's no infrastructure there and they're very poor and they end up doing pickpocketing and stuff to make ends meet, and are widely reviled, and it's a shame, and they get the finger pointed for children being nicked and trafficked, but in fact they are the most vulnerable to people traffickers because they're poor and because they're not necessarily registered by the state and they don't have that support. So that's a lot of what this series is about. the main thing at the core are the relationships, and just coming back to Chief Inspector Van den Bergen, him and George have got this fabulous rapport that goes on throughout the 3 books, and he was an absolute joyous character for me to paint, because as a middle-aged person I could really put my heart and soul into this cantankerous old git, but he's in love with George, and it's quite nice to do this detective that can, you know, value a strong woman that tells him where to get off. And he's a bit mushy at heart, even though he's this kind of grizzled old detective. So I'm just going to read you a little extract. Let me check how I do every time. A little extract where George is flirting with him, and you can see what kind of electricity they have between them. I promise you it's not wrong. Looking at George was difficult. Though they'd spoken regularly on the phone and briefly by email, Van den Bergen hadn't seen her in the flesh for months, and that flesh looked amazing, what he could see at any rate. Fresh-faced, bright-eyed, even in her self-imposed uniform of black jeans and a plain black hooded top, every inch of her was beautiful. Somebody else is beautiful. "You staying at Carol's?" he asked, taking a bite out of his sandwich. They had no real inclination to eat. The cafe was mercifully empty, just a waiter staring up at a small TV suspended on a wall bracket. He'd been careful to select a place at several streets away from the station, where he knew his colleagues did not go. George shook her head, toyed with one of those amazing curls that sprouted from her scalp like a gravity-defying firework whizzing skywards in a corkscrew. He loved the challenge of sketching those. Perhaps she'd let him paint her this time. "The crack pot," she said, "just for a couple of nights, then I'll see." "Not staying at Carol's?" This was a turn-up. "How come?" Slurping her soup noisily, she shrugged. "Space." She was eyeing the pink of the new skin on his knuckles. "You want to tell me about that, then?" If he told her, he would reveal too much and risk scaring her off. Damn, why hadn't he kept his mouth shut about that? "What are your first impressions of Arla's?" he asked, pushing a codeine tablet out of the blister pack. George leaned across the table, grabbed his hand. "Hey, you can pack that in for a start. I didn't come over here to watch you poison yourself slowly." He was reluctant. The blurring had worn off during her interview with Arla's, leaving him exposed to feeling the pain. "Let me take this one. I can't get through the afternoon without it. The headaches are... Jesus, Paul, you're a fucking mess. What's going on with you?" She let go of his hand, allowing him to swallow the tablet down with a mouthful of strong coffee. It quelled the anxiety that had been building within him, but he wished she'd not let go. Her skin was so soft and warm. It was so long since he'd felt a woman's touch. Another man's woman, though. That idiot Carol's woman. Ha! It was a joke. What did that spineless prick have that was so alluring? He was no better than Numbnuts, Tamara's buffoon of a fiancé. Smoothing down the front of his sweater, he was relieved that the musculature beneath it was at least still paunch-free, if a little on the bony side at the moment. She'd come all the way to Amsterdam at his request, hadn't she? Feel the fear and do it anyway, Van den Bergen. "Let's talk about that tonight," he said. "Come round to mine. I'll order in takeout. We'll open a nice bottle of wine. You can sleep in the spare room. It's clean. How does that sound?" She smiled, and it was as though the sun shone through the cafe window, warming everything, lighting up the dark places within him. "Yeah, okay. Too many bad memories in that old room anyway." She pushed her bowl of soup away, half drunk. "I've been feeling a bit rough since that loon tried to feed me God knows what." Raised an eyebrow and fixed him with those big brown eyes. Hadn't Marie spoken about some article or other she'd read online that said if you stare into somebody's eyes for long enough, they fall in love with you? He determined to hold her gaze for as long as possible, but only managed 20 or so seconds. Damn. "You're normally a good judge of character," he said. "What went wrong?" "Arla seemed all right, I guess," she said. "If he hadn't, and if Katia hadn't have vouched for him, I'd certainly never have gone to his place." She rubbed her face, rolled her eyes. Christ knows. You rang and expected me to come running, but I've been feeling so trapped lately, so controlled. I was being spontaneous, I guess, rebellious. She started to position the condiments in a perfectly straight line that bisected the table, leading from her to him. Connect the dots. Connects that mesmerising woman and this ageing, crumbling man. So that's Van den Bergen and George, and he's much, much older than her. And yeah, you could accuse him of being a dirty old man, but they're just so well matched. I don't know, it just seemed right that they should fall in love, but they have this wonderful combustible relationship where they're always at each other's throats and never quite have more than a fleeting nanosecond of passion, and then they're just shouting again. And I enjoy writing that, actually. I guess I live vicariously a bit through my characters. And in fact, George has that with her family members, is that they have this wonderfully close and warm relationship with one another, with her Auntie Sharon and her cousins Patrice and Tanisha. But they all end up rowing, and they're very shouty, and Letitia is a cow. And I don't mind telling you that she's got narcissistic personality disorder and is very difficult. And that's one of the things I love writing, and why I love the series so much, is that I'm able to continue these relationships over the books. So you've got the love story going on, and you've got the family saga going on. I think that crime should not just seek to tell a story about real life crime, and you know, the people who profit from it, the people who fail and are victims at the end of it, but also the lives of those investigating it and how it affects people. And you know, so that's basically my George McKenzie series. I was going to read another extract about George and her family arguing, but the South East London accent's just so dodgy. I think I'll spare you from that. So that's it in a nutshell. It was my answers to Stieg Larsson and Silence of the Lambs, and now I'm 4 books down the line come mid-November, and still feel like I have a lot of stories to tell from George and Van den Bergen. So sorry if that ended up a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but there you go, that's my series. And if you have any questions, please do ask.
I was wondering if you were going to get a job with EastEnders, because your accent's quite good.
It's not great. It's supposed to be South East London, but apparently I come over a bit EastEnders.
Well, we don't know any better.
No, it could be, yeah.
So
I remember to say grass, so. I do sound the accents out in my head when I'm writing the dialogue. They all sound a lot better than when I'm reading them out.
You seem to have a lot of strong themes in your books, Marnie, so do you have a whole queue of them in your mind that you want to attack next?
I think the themes emerge as I'm writing them, actually. It's been a weird series. I mean, the first book I wrote, The Girl Who Wouldn't Die, I wrote originally back in 2010 I started it. You know, that's a long, long time ago, and I guess, what was I trying to write about then? What was I trying to say then? I was still very much fixated on young adult fiction then, which is why she's so young. She's 20, and I guess I aspired to make her slightly new adult, which was a category that was big in America back then, but never really took off here. So that was my concern then, and there's a lot of stuff about Islamic fundamentalism in that book, as well as the gang stuff. So that was on my mind back in that time. But by the time I got round to writing The Girl Who Broke the Rules, I mean, my mother was ill with cancer, unfortunately, and she'd been ill before, but she got it back. And Van den Bergen, his father had died of lung cancer, and he'd become very anxious as a result of it, because he'd nursed him through the chemo to the end. And he does actually have some panic attacks in this, and is quite depressed and needs some medication and therapy and some help. So that was coming out in this when I wrote it. And Van den Berkel was my mouthpiece to talk about my mother having been ill with cancer and me having. Well, actually, she'd recovered from the first bout when I started writing this, and then she got ill with a second, coincidentally. So those were themes that emerged from this, and also George breaks up with her boyfriend in this and ends up having a bit of a thing with Van den Berkel, and my marriage was on the rocks at the time. So a lot of the angst that, and I felt quite. I mean, don't get me wrong. I have a very good relationship with my ex-husband, but I was feeling very suffocated, and that was part of the reason why my marriage ended. I don't mind telling you, and a lot of that came out. Actually, this kind of itching to be free, that came out as a theme as I was writing it. So, and then when you come to The Girl Who Walked in the Shadows, I wrote that as my mother was dying, and did I finish it? Yeah, she was terminally ill at that stage, and that's a very dark book. I mean, there's humour in it to lighten. I always believe you should put some humour in to lighten up the dark places, but this was inspired in part by the Madeleine McCann disappearance. So it's about missing kids, but it's very dark as well. It's quite despairing, and I wouldn't say it was heavy. I mean, you've read it, Gordon, haven't you? What would you say about this book? You enjoyed it, didn't you?
Yeah. It was a film. I've read, obviously, Madeline's McCann's.
Yeah.
One of the claustrophobic things.
Yeah, right. So that was coming out in my writing because of what I was going through. At the time, I was going through divorce and losing my mother. So those are the themes, you know, that sort of feeling emerges as you're writing, I think. But the trafficking thing was something that came out in the first book independently. You know, that was something I wanted to write about, and that was about drugs trafficking, and also I touched on people trafficking. So there was some stuff about girls and drugs being imported from Helmand province, because Afghanistan is a massive area for growing herring crops, opium and stuff. And then it was decided with my publisher that I should keep the trafficking theme going. And I already had in my head the sort of story that I wanted to write with The Girl Who Broke the Rules, which is mainly about organ trafficking. And trafficked people being exploited not just for labour but for their body parts as well. Jolly themes. I suppose it's tempered by the fact that there's a lot of George's family in the second book, and her Auntie Sharon's fairly hilarious and works as a barmaid in a strip club in Soho, so much hilarity ensues. But you know, the female members of my family were always hysterically funny as well as really struggling for money. You know, my mother and my auntie were just outlandishly funny and outrageous and outspoken and bitched with each other constantly and rowed, but were just very funny with it. And I think you often get that the poor people that are on the bones of the arse are often hysterically funny because if they don't laugh, they'll cry. So there was a lot of that in that book. And then, you know, The Girl Who Walked in the Shadows is basically about, there's a paedophilia ring and child pornography ring and missing kids and all sorts of nasty stuff. But I wanted to do it with a lightness, a touch that wasn't sensationalist, but I did want to talk about it. So, I mean, a lot of it's had really good reviews, and I think a lot of people thought that I'd done it as well as I could, without it being icky to read. So. And there's a man who kills people by stabbing them with icicles, which is what more could you want from a novel? So, any other questions?
What do you think behind them being on the release on eBook rather than having the hard copy as well?
Well, my publisher Avon, which is the commercial fiction imprint of HarperCollins, they wanted this series straight away. The minute they read it, within a couple of weeks, they were like, "Yeah, we want it." But unfortunately, they were going through a period of restructuring at the time, and it took a long time. It took a year to hammer the deal into place. And during that year, they introduced this eBook, digital first imprint. And it was a shame, really. It was just awful timing. I was meant to be on their main list, and they have huge traditional successes in paperback, like C.L. Taylor, who does The Lion, The Missing, and Paul Finch, who's another good crime writer. And I ended up, I guess they were taking a bit of a risk having a mixed race lead character, really, a black lead character, because it's not really been done before in commercial fiction, and I guess they didn't know how well it would sell. Well, of course, it's just the colour of the skin. Actually, it's not just the colour of the skin. I tried to do her family's cultural heritage as well as I possibly can, and make it clear that they're from Jamaican descent and not shy away from that. But I guess I has started out on this digital imprint because it was a bit of a let's see if this flies, and it has done really well, and I've sold over 100,000 books so far in just over a year, which is not bad going, so people like it. But I've got a new series coming out next year, which is in paperback. It's called the Manchester series, about Manchester crime families. And the first one's called Born Bad, and I'm supposed to be the Northern Martina Cole. Except she's got a really posh Bentley and a bodyguard, and I turned up with my shopping bag and my umbrella and my pals. But yeah, so I've got that coming out next year. And I am a Mancunian born and bred, and I don't live on a rough council estate anymore, but I've got a lot of family that still do, and I live near those areas. I drive through them regularly, and Manchester's not changed over the years. So I like to think that I bring a bit of authenticity. The George books will go into print within 12 months of these Manchester books coming out. So I'm hoping that there'll just be a slew of Marnie Ritchie's books on the shelves in Asda and Waterstones, Sainsbury's, hopefully.
Libraries.
Oh, libraries, of course. Yeah. It'll be a long time coming, though. I'll have earned my stripes, really.
Do you have sort of alternative titles for Oldham, or are you now starting to call them the girlhood as you're able?
Well, now it's just the girl who. And to be honest, I'm like, what do you think we should call this? Yeah, go on then. The first one, as I said, was meant to be blown away because I had this clever metaphor. And the second one was meant to be called Empty Vessel because it was about organ trafficking and eviscerated bodies, and there was this thing about an empty vessel makes the most noise because one of the characters in it was just really irritating. So that again was meant to be this kind of arty-farty, terribly clever metaphor running through it. And the publisher said, no, that's not going to sell. It's going to be the girl who. So they came up with the girl who wouldn't die. They came up with the girl who broke the rules. I came up with the girl who walked in the shadows. And the new one, the girl who had no fear. I can sit and write a book that's 120,000 words long, but you asked me to come up with a decent title that's a couple of words long, and I just can't do it. So I'm just happy for them to come up with the names. And I think a lot of authors are, because at the end of the day, publishers are there to sell books to readers so that readers will buy them and enjoy them, or get them out of the library and enjoy them. And if they've got titles that won't be eye-catching or rubbish covers, then it defeats the object, because I'm not writing books to do what I did with my first novel about Charlemagne the Great. I don't want to put them in a folder in the bottom of a wardrobe for 17 years and leave them there. Especially with my crime fiction, I'm hoping that I'm doing a kind of service in a way, because I'm talking about subjects that lots of people don't really know much about, but that actually is very important. But everyone should know that there's a real problem with people trafficking and drug trafficking, and that it's not just what you see at the end of your street, that it's transnational. It's, you know, it goes as far as the Far East and not just in the Americas. And you know, I think it's important that readers know that if they buy recreational cocaine at the weekend and don't think twice, that actually they're funding these huge criminal empires that do some really nasty stuff to people. Let's just think twice about that. There's me moralising. I shouldn't moralise really, but you need to understand that there's a trickle-down effect to everything you do. You know, there's a knock-on effect and consequences. And those, you know, I don't want that to sit and not get read. So I guess every writer is a bit of an egotist in that respect. Anything else?
Have you got a favourite anecdote about Charlemagne the Great?
He was meant to be 7 foot tall, and in fact I've seen his relics in the cathedral in Aachen, and they're pretty dusty. Yeah, he's old.
Any further questions before we finish?
Well, thank you all for coming. Thanks for having me. I hope that wasn't too boring.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on, and I think she deserves a round of applause for normally we would have a book sale at the end of an event, but obviously with our books being an ebook only, we can't sell them. But I do have little slips of paper which, if Marnie would be so happy, you would sign some, and if you could stick them in the hard copy ones once the Manchester Seeds comes out, and you can have a kind of signed copy when it eventually comes out. But I think I would just like to thank Marnie again for another fantastic evening.
Thanks for having me.
Also on the seats there's wee feedback slips. If you want to give your feedback on the event, if you can fill out that and you'll be sent out a wee email with the feedback form at a later date. But other than that, thank you very much for coming, guys. And
Thanks.